Welcome back to Blender Daily. In today's video I want to demonstrate how you can create this abstract loop animation within Blender. I explain everything step by step, so you should be able to follow along even if you are a beginner in Blender. Let's get started. Let's start off by deleting everything that we have in our default scene, and I want to press Shift A to bring in a new torus. Now in this tutorial we are going to use a lot of modifiers. So the first one that we're going to add is going to be a decimate modifier. We want to switch this to unsubdivide and give it one iteration so we get this nice pattern in here. Now we can even improve this pattern by going to add modifier again, and this time we're going to select the triangulate node. This will give us a different pattern. And then I also want to add a subdivision surface modifier that I'm going to switch to simple. And I want to bring down the render level so they both are at 1, the viewport level and the render level. And then we can turn this into a wireframe. So let's also add a wireframe modifier. And at this point I want to scale up the torus, so I tab into edit mode, press S to scale, and 3 to scale it up 3 times. So now we have this big torus with this pattern, and I don't want to have only the wireframe. I also want to have the original mesh, so I just disable replace original, so we have both. Okay, so let's bring in our camera. So I'm gonna press Shift A, bring in a new camera, and press Ctrl numpad 0 to make it the active camera. Then Alt R to reset the rotation. And now I'm gonna rotate it RX 90 degrees along the x-axis. Then let's place it inside of the torus. So GX to move it along the x-axis. And this should be 3 units. So I just press 3. And now the camera is placed inside of this torus. Now we want to see a bit more with this camera, so I go to the camera properties and just bring down the focal length until we can see everything, which should be around 15 millimeters. Okay, so this already looks pretty good, so let's add the animation. So one way of doing this would be to animate the camera to go through the torus and rotate around it, but I think it's way easier to just take the torus and RZ rotate it along the Z axis, which will look exactly the same, but it's a lot easier to animate. And I want to make this animation 350 frames long. So let's scale out a bit. And since we want to loop this, we're going to start with the animation on frame 0, so we get a seamless loop. If you not start with the keyframe on frame 0, you will have a double frame, so you will have the same frame at the beginning, at the end, and your seams will be visible in the loop. So just go to frame 0 to set the first keyframe, which we're going to do in the object properties, and just go to the set rotation and press on this button to add a keyframe. Then we go to the last frame, give it a rotation of minus 360 degrees and add another keyframe. So when we now scrub through the timeline, you can see that this torus is rotating. Now the issue we're having is, as you can see, it starts off slow, then it will speed up, and in the end it will slow down again, which will make our loop visible extremely well. We don't want this, so I'm gonna hover over the timeline with all the keyframes selected, press T, and switch the keyframe interpolation to linear. So now the rotation always has the same speed. So let's take a look at this from the camera view. And I think this already looks pretty cool. But it is a bit boring since it is always the same. So let's add a bit of variation to this torus with a displacement modifier. So I'm going to close up all those modifiers, bring in a new one, which is going to be a displacement modifier. I want to bring this after the decimate Then click on the plus to add a new texture, and let's go to the texture editor. Here I want to give it a clouds texture. Maybe adjust the scale a bit, but I think this doesn't really matter. Maybe bring the depth down to 1, and I think we can give it even more strength. So 1.5 should be fine. So let's look at it from the camera. Okay, this is already more interesting, but maybe we can also bring up the mid-level to 0.6 to make everything a bit tighter. And yeah, I think this is way more interesting. Maybe make this 0.55 just a bit bigger. Okay. And it gets even better once we start to animate the rotation of the camera. So let's select the camera. Again, go to frame 0 and add a keyframe for the, I think it is the Y rotation. Yeah, exactly, the Y rotation. Here, bring in a keyframe. Go to the last frame. Make this rotate 360 degrees. Add another keyframe. And yeah, again, press T to change the interpolation to linear. So now this animation is even more interesting. Okay, so that's basically it for the animation. So let's give this some materials. So I'm going to switch to the render preview. Currently everything is black and we are in cycles. So for me, the default render engine is Cycles. For you, this might already be Eevee. But in this case, we want to use Eevee since it will render a lot faster and look pretty good for this animation. So yeah, let's select our torus object and give it 2 shaders. So go to the material settings, give it a material. The first one is going to be for the base material, and the second one is for the wireframe. Now I want the wireframe material to be an emission shader. So just switch this to, where is it? Right here, emission. And now to make the wireframe actually use this material, we need to go to the wireframe modifier and bring this material offset up to 1. So now, as you can see, it will offset the material slot, so it will use the base material for everything, and for the wireframe it will use the second slot. So again, let's go into the camera, and I think this wireframe is way too big, so go back to the modifiers and bring down the scale, maybe 0.002, which already looks better. Now when playing back animations in Eevee, I like to go to the render settings and disable viewport denoising, and I think this looks better without this viewport denoising enabled. And this is only for the viewport, so this won't have any effect on the final render. Okay, now we still have a lot of light from the environment, which is why everything looks so gray. So I'm gonna go to the world properties and just bring down this color to completely black, so we don't have any of these. So let's open up a shader editor to further adjust this material. Let's go into the shader editor. Here we have our wireframe shader. And yeah, if you don't have the wireframe shader, just go to the material properties, and here you can switch between the base and the wireframe. Now I want to make this a bit stronger, let's say 10. And in the render properties, I also want to enable bloom, so we get this glowing effect. Now for our render, I also want ambient occlusion and screen space reflections. Okay, let's give this this blue, kind of blue-purple color. I think this looks pretty good, but it is quite boring that everything looks exactly the same. So I want to add spots that are a bit darker, where we don't have any light, and other spots where we have those blue lights. So for this, we're going to use a noise texture. Noise texture right here. And plug this into the color. Then bring in a converter color ramp node. And let's quickly disable, bring this out, go to the white color and just drag and drop this blue color in here. So we have the same color again. Now we need to add a bit more contrast. So bring in the black stop and also bring down the scale of the noise texture. So we get those spots where we don't have any light or where it is a bit darker and others where it is brighter. So I think we can adjust this scale even more. Maybe also give it a bit of distortion and increase the detail. So let's look at this again. I'll bring the scale back down. Maybe even more. Let's try 1. Yeah, so we really have those black spots. But I think we need even more. So let's press Ctrl T or just bring in a texture coordinate node and connect the object coordinates to the vector. I prefer to use object coordinates. And let's further adjust the scale of the noise. So I think we can bring this down to 0.2. So we get a few of those black spots. Maybe even more. So 0.05. No, I'm gonna bring this back to 0.2 and just play with this color ramp. Maybe even up to 0.5. Again, let's look at it from the camera view. And I think now it is pretty good. Okay, but I want to increase the strength of the emission. Let's say 25. Make this a bit more bright and also bring this more to the purple color. Okay. Now I think I don't want to have those black spots to be completely black. So I hover over this purple color, press Ctrl C to copy the color. Go to the black spot, Ctrl V to paste. And just bring down the brightness on them very low. So the spots are not completely black. So we can still see the wireframe, but it is just very dark. So maybe bring this value down even more. So this is just extremely subtle. Okay, so what I usually also like to do is I select the camera, go to the camera settings, and under viewport display, right here, and bring up the passport 2, so we only see what is within the camera view and what is going to be rendered in the end. So we don't have those distracting parts on the top and the bottom. Okay, so let's bring in a few particles. So I'm gonna switch back to the solid preview. And when I tried this effect, I added the particles to this torus object. However, this didn't really work because it really slowed down the animation because this has so many polygons already. So I think it is better to bring in another torus object. Then let's scale this up to a radius of 3. And also increase this other radius so that it covers our inner torus. And we can now add the particles to this object. But first we need to add an object that we want to scatter as a particle, which in this case is going to be an icosphere with just one subdivision. And let's just move this to the side and select our torus again. Go to the particle settings, give it a new particle system. We are going to use hair. And for the source, we're going to use the volume. And we don't want jitter distribution. Instead, we want random distribution. Then let's also go to the viewport display, which is right here, and disable show emitter. So we don't see the actual torus and only the particles. Now to actually scatter this icosphere, let's select, go back to our particle system, and under render, switch this from path to object, take this eyedropper and select the icosphere. So it will now distribute a lot of those icospheres. We can tap into edit mode, scale this down a bit, just to make them smaller. And let's take a look at it from the camera view. I think we can make them even smaller in the particle settings, so that they are really small. Maybe make a bit more, say 2000. And yeah, maybe make the scale also a bit random. So I bring this up to 0.5. And the issue now is that the particles are not moving together with this torus that we created. So you can see that the inner torus is rotating, however our particles are not. Now to fix this, select the outer torus, shift click on the inner one, and then Control P, set parent to object, and now the particles will rotate together with our inner torus. And when we take a look at it from the camera view, this also looks better. So back in the shader editor, we can see that those particles don't have any shader yet. So let's select the icosphere, the shader editor, give it a new material. Then let's delete this principal BSDF node and instead bring in an emission shader. Plug this into the surface, say strength of 15. And I don't want all of them to have exactly the same color. So I bring in a converter color ramp node, plug this into the color, and let's give it a gradient. So between purple and this dark blue. And now to actually randomize it, we need an object info node, which is under input, and this is right here, object info. Take the random output and put it into the input of the color ramp. And now you can see we have some blue particles and some that are more purple, which just gives us a bit of variation. Now let's play this, and yeah, I think this looks pretty cool. Maybe let's take the wireframe again, go to the wireframe modifier and make it just a bit bigger. 0.004. So we can see it a bit more. And yeah, that's basically it. So let's make a test render. Going to the rendering, press F12. And let's see what this looks like. Okay, there are a few adjustments that I want to make. So first in the render properties, I also want to enable motion blur. So let's enable it and press F12 again. So now you can see that we have a bit of motion blur. Now I think this is too much, so let's just bring down the shutter to 0.2. F12 again to see what this looks like now, and I think, yeah, this is better. Now the motion blur is only visible in the final render, so you won't be able to see this in the render preview. But what I also want to add is a bit of a depth of field. So I'm going to select the camera, go to the camera properties and enable depth of field. Then I hover over the focus distance and press E to get the eyedropper tool. Then select the focus point in your scene, and I think I want to place this around here. Maybe bring down the f-stop to give it a bit more depth of field. And now you can see that the parts that are close to the camera are blurred, and our sharp area is around here, which will just make it look a bit more interesting. And I think what I also want to improve is the base material. So select our torus object, switch to slot 1, which is the base. And I'm just going to bring down the roughness of this so we have those reflections in here, which will make it look more interesting. Maybe also make it metallic. Bring down the base color, make it a bit darker, and this looks a lot more interesting in my opinion. Okay, so let's make another test render. And yeah, this already looks even better. So let's also go to the color management, and I want to add a bit more contrast. So I switch the look to, let's say, high contrast or even very high contrast. But I think high contrast is enough. And if you want to, you could also use this curve to adjust the colors even more. But I think I'm not going to use this in this case. Yet there's one last thing that I want to do, which is in the compositing. Enable use nodes. Let's close this timeline. And so we can see what we are doing. We also need a viewer node. So Shift A, output, viewer node. Let's take a look at this. And I want to bring in a Shift A lens distortion node, which is right here. Take a look at this, and if you want to really see the backdrop, so if you want to scale it down, you can use the shortcut Alt Home, which will scale it to the window size. And now we can increase this dispersion. So if we bring this to a value of 0.1, you can see that we get this distortion at the border of our image. So I think this is too strong, so let's make it 0.02. So we get just a slight effect. And I also want to enable fit so we don't get any borders on our image. And let's take a look at the animation again, but I think that's it for this project. So let's render it out. So I'm going to go to the rendering tab, go to the output properties. Now I want to render this at 1920 by 1080. If you want to, you can increase this resolution, but for me, this is okay. I want to export this as an MP4 file, so I switch to FFmpeg video. Then under encoding, I can select the MP4 preset, but I want to increase the output quality from medium quality to high quality. Then I go in here, select an output folder, which is going to be the desktop for me, and I'm just going to call this loop. Accept. And now to render the animation, you can either use the shortcut Control F12 or just go up to render and choose render animation. And since we're rendering this in Eevee, this should be fairly quick. As you can see, this is around 1 second per frame for me. So this should be rendered in a few minutes. Okay, so here's my final result, and I think it came out really cool. I hope it worked for you as well, and you could follow along with me. If you have any further questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, and I will try to answer them as soon as possible. This video is sponsored by Polygonic, the creators of my favorite Blender add-ons. One of their plugins is called Materialic, which is a huge material library with lots of realistic high-quality shaders optimized for both Cycles and Eevee. I use it all the time, and I love how quick and intuitive it is. Learn more about the add-on with the link in the video description. I am Nick from Blender Daily. See you in the next one.